Millionaire CEO was mistaken for an IT technician by the new secretary and fell madly in love. Emily Carter didn't have time to panic. She barely had time to think. It was her first day as an executive assistant, and everything was already spiraling out of control. The buzzing energy inside the Foster Enterprises headquarters was nothing short of pure chaos. Phones were ringing off the hook. Frantic voices echoed through the halls, and employees rushed back and forth with panicked expressions. "The system's down," someone shouted, running past Emily's desk. "We lost access to everything, emails, reports, client data, even payroll," another voice chimed in, their tone laced with sheer panic. Emily's heart pounded as she gripped the edge of her desk. This was not how she had imagined her first day. She had expected to ease into her role, familiarize herself with her boss's schedule, and maybe, just maybe, have time to grab a coffee before diving into work. But no, fate had other plans. Her computer screen was black, frozen in defiance of her repeated attempts to restart it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, useless against the technological disaster unfolding around her. "The IT department is ignoring calls," a woman wailed from the other end of the office. "Wonderful, just wonderful." Emily took a deep breath, pushing back the overwhelming frustration building in her chest. If nobody else was going to fix this, then she had to take control. After all, wasn't that what she was hired for? She grabbed the office phone and dialed IT support herself. A busy signal. She tried again. Nothing. She clenched her jaw. She was not going to let this be her first failure. With renewed determination, she stood, ready to find someone who could help, when suddenly the answer seemed to walk right through the front doors. A tall, broad-shouldered man entered the office, completely unbothered by the madness around him. His tailored navy suit fit him perfectly. His polished shoes clicked against the floor with confidence, and his strong jawline and piercing green eyes gave him an air of quiet authority. He had an expensive wristwatch on one hand and held his phone loosely in the other, observing the scene as if he had just stepped into a mildly interesting movie rather than a corporate disaster. Emily didn't hesitate. Finally, she blurted, marching straight toward him, her heels clicking against the tile floor. The man barely had time to react before she grabbed his wrist and started leading him toward the nearest computer. "You took way too long. The system is down, everyone's losing their minds, and I don't even know where the bathroom is. Fix this, now." The man raised an eyebrow, his lips curving slightly, as if amused. "Excuse me?" he asked, his deep voice calm and unhurried. Emily let out an exasperated sigh. "Excuse me nothing. Just fix it before I get fired on my first day and this company burns to the ground." To her surprise, instead of looking nervous or annoyed, the man actually chuckled, a small, low laugh that sent a strange, unfamiliar sensation through Emily's chest. "What if I told you I can't fix it?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Emily groaned, rubbing her temples. "Oh, fantastic. First day, and they send me the slowest IT guy on the planet. Look, if you don't want to work, at least pretend to care." The man's eyes twinkled with something between amusement and disbelief. "So, I should at least pretend to care?" he repeated, as if testing the words. Emily crossed her arms, impatient. "Yes, and work on that computer like you're solving the cure for the century." With an exaggerated sigh, he stepped forward and sat in the chair Emily had practically shoved him into. She hovered over his shoulder, watching his movements carefully. "Wow, so slow. Are you typing with one finger?" she complained. He stopped typing and looked up at her. "Am I really being asked to work faster by you?" Emily narrowed her eyes. "Yes, what do you think this is? Brain surgery? It's just a computer. Click, fix, done." The man sighed theatrically, as if this were the hardest task he had ever faced, and turned back to the screen. 5 minutes later, he finally leaned back in his chair. "Well, finished." Emily let out a breath of relief. "Finally, that wasn't so hard, was it?" she said, clapping her hands together. The man stood slowly, adjusting the sleeves of his suit with effortless elegance. "That was interesting." Emily sighed in relief and pointed toward the next department. "Great, now you can go up to the next floor and fix their system too." The man's lips quirked into a smirk. "And who said I work here?" Emily froze mid-step. The sentence hung in the air, the words slicing through her brain like a knife through butter. Her stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. It was then that a middle-aged man in a gray suit entered the room, looking slightly sweaty and incredibly stressed. "Sir, everyone is waiting for you in the boardroom. We should go now." Emily blinked. Boardroom? She turned back toward the man she had just dragged to a computer and insulted for being too slow. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her with a mix of amusement and something far more dangerous. Slowly, realization slammed into her like a freight train. He wasn't the IT guy. He was James Sterling, CEO of Foster Enterprises. Her boss. The entire office fell into a stunned silence. Emily felt her face burn red as her mind screamed in flashing neon lights. "I'm fired." James took a slow step toward her, his smirk deepening as he tilted his head. "So, Miss Carter, any more orders for me?" The world crumbled around her. Emily wanted to disappear into thin air, dig a hole and crawl inside. Or, better yet, rewind time to 5 minutes ago when she still had a job. Her hands started sweating, and her throat went dry. "Oh, my God." And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, James chuckled again, clearly enjoying himself. "Well," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "this is going to be interesting." And just like that, Emily Carter's first day at Foster Enterprises became the biggest disaster in company history. Emily Carter sat in stunned silence, her entire world crumbling around her. The whispers in the office had died down, but she could still feel the burning stares of her coworkers. Her boss, not the IT guy, not some junior employee, but the CEO of the entire company, stood in front of her. Arms crossed, eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and something more dangerous. Her pulse thundered in her ears. This couldn't be happening. This was career suicide, and she had barely made it through the first morning of her first day. James Sterling, the very man she had barked orders at, shoved into a chair, and called incompetent, tilted his head, studying her like a scientist observing an interesting lab experiment. "So, Miss Carter, any more orders for me?" Emily felt her legs turn to jelly. Her brain screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. She opened her mouth, desperate to salvage what was left of her dignity. But no words came out. James lifted an eyebrow, speechless now. "Are we?" The entire office held its breath, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. And then, just to make her humiliation complete, her voice betrayed her completely. "Ha, ha ha, ha." Oh God, she was laughing. Not normal laughing. Hysterical. Panicked. "I've lost my mind," laughing. James actually looked mildly concerned, which only made it worse. She slapped a hand over her mouth, forcing herself to breathe through the embarrassment consuming her whole existence. James smirked. "Well, that's certainly an interesting reaction." Emily wanted to evaporate into the atmosphere, leave her mortal form behind, and float into space, never to be seen again. A sharp cough from James's assistant reminded her that she was still in the middle of an active workplace disaster. "Sir," the assistant muttered hesitantly, clearly unsure if she should rescue Emily or watch her implode. "The board meeting is waiting." James gave one final glance at Emily, then turned on his heel without another word, heading toward the conference room. His assistant shot Emily a half-sympathetic, half-amused look before following him. The moment the door clicked shut, the entire office erupted. People whispered, others gawked, and someone actually dropped their coffee cup, shattering it on the floor. Emily collapsed into her chair, burying her burning face in her hands. This was it. Her first day. Her last day. There was no way she was making it out of this alive. She waited for the inevitable email from Hour, telling her to pack up her things. But as the minutes stretched on, nothing came. The silence was even worse than being fired. Was James letting this slide? No. Impossible. This was the CEO. He probably had a whole department dedicated to firing people for less than this. She peeked through her fingers at her computer screen. Still nothing. Maybe he was waiting to handle it in person. Oh God, that was worse. Her coworkers began inching toward her, their curiosity too powerful to resist. One of them, a woman with glasses and a sympathetic expression, leaned against Emily's desk. "So, you're still breathing?" Emily groaned. "Barely." Another coworker, probably someone who thrived on corporate drama, whispered. "What did he say? Did he yell?" "Did he?" Emily waved a tired hand. He didn't yell. He just looked at me. Like I was some kind of wild animal that had accidentally wandered into the boardroom. The woman bit her lip. Honestly? You might have just cemented yourself in company history. No one has ever dared to boss him around before. Emily dropped her head onto the desk. Yeah, well, I'd rather not go down in history for public execution. A soft ding from her computer made her jump. An email. Her heart plummeted to her stomach. Our. It had to be our. With trembling fingers, she clicked on it, but it wasn't from our. It was from James Sterling himself. Her blood turned to ice. Miss Carter, my office. Now, she could feel every pair of eyes in the office on her as she read the email. Someone whispered, "Oh, you're so dead." Her chair creaked as she stood. Her knees weak as she walked toward the lion's den. The moment she reached his office, she hesitated. Breathe, just breathe. She knocked twice. Come in, came his voice, calm and composed. Emily opened the door. James was seated behind his massive desk. His fingers interlaced as he studied her with sharp green eyes. The office was pristine, decorated in sleek black and glass, the expensive scent of cologne lingering in the air. Emily stood frozen, waiting for the final blow. Instead, James leaned back in his chair and, to her horror, smiled. Miss Carter, he said smoothly, please, have a seat. She hesitated. Not a trap, I promise, he added. Amused. Slowly, she sat down. James rested his chin on his hand, watching her like he was still trying to figure her out. You have an interesting approach to problem solving, he mused. Emily swallowed hard. Sir, he held up a hand. Relax. If I wanted to fire you, I wouldn't have wasted time calling you here. She blinked. So, you're not firing me? His lips quirked. Not today. Emily let out a long, shaky breath, barely believing what she was hearing. I don't tolerate incompetence, he continued, but I do value people who take initiative. Emily nodded quickly, afraid that if she said the wrong thing, he'd change his mind and have security drag her out of the building. James smirked. You're lucky I have a sense of humor. Emily was not laughing. He steepled his fingers. I need a personal assistant. Someone who can handle pressure. Someone who doesn't crumble in front of me. Emily felt her breath hitch. Was this a promotion? He leaned forward slightly. You clearly aren't afraid of me, he said. That makes you useful. Emily stared. Was he complimenting her? Threatening her? Both? She swallowed. I thought you called me in here to fire me. James laughed, actually laughed. Well, Miss Carter, that would have been the obvious thing to do. But I don't always do the obvious thing. He tilted his head. So, what do you say? Emily's brain screamed at her to say no. To get up and leave before she became permanently entangled in whatever game this man was playing. But something in his eyes held her there. And then, against all logic and reason, she found herself nodding. I accept. James smiled. And just like that, Emily Carter's nightmare turned into an opportunity she never saw coming. But deep down, she knew, working for James Sterling was going to be nothing short of a battlefield. And for some reason, she wasn't running away. What do you think will happen next? Do you think Emily made the right choice? Comment below. If you love unexpected twists, office drama, and impossible bosses, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter. Emily Carter never thought she'd end up like this. Standing in the pouring rain, clutching a cardboard box filled with the last remnants of her life at Foster Enterprises. She tried to hold back the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She had survived humiliation, impossible deadlines, and the intense scrutiny of James Sterling. She had fought her way up from being a nobody to someone who mattered in the company. But none of that had mattered in the end. Because now, she was fired. The icy wind whipped around her, biting at her soaked skin as she stared up at the towering skyscraper she had once walked into every morning with determination. It wasn't fair. It wasn't supposed to end like this. But it had. And worst of all, she didn't even know why. Emily had started the day like any other, with too much caffeine and a mental list of everything she had to get done before James found a new way to push her past her limits. She had barely settled at her desk when a familiar voice cut through her thoughts. Miss Carter, my office. Now, James Sterling stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Emily groaned inwardly. What now? The entire office stilled as she followed him down the hall. They all knew that when the CEO called someone in, it was either a massive opportunity or the beginning of their downfall. Emily had no idea which one this was. The moment the door clicked shut, James leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Tell me, Miss Carter, are you loyal?" Emily blinked. "Excuse me? Loyal?" James repeated. "Do you stand by the people who stand by you?" Emily frowned. "Of course I do." James watched her for a long moment, as if trying to read something buried deep within her. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Good, because I need you to do something." The way he said it made a shiver crawl up her spine. She swallowed. "What kind of something?" James exhaled slowly, looking almost hesitant, which was highly unusual for him. "There's an issue with the board," he said finally. "Someone is trying to undermine me. I need someone I trust to handle something important." Emily straightened. "Tell me what to do." For the first time, James actually looked relieved. That should have been her first warning sign. The task seemed simple. James needed files retrieved from the financial department to confirm discrepancies in one of the board members' accounts. No big deal. Emily had done far worse. But the moment she stepped into the finance office, she felt the shift in the air. People whispered behind her back. Eyes lingered on her too long. Something was off. She shook it off, walked up to the department head, and gave a polite smile. "Mr. Higgins, I need access to last quarter's reports." Higgins, a graying man in his late 50s who always smelled vaguely of printer ink, looked at her like she had grown two heads. "You want what?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Emily stood her ground. "The reports. James Sterling asked me to get them personally." Higgins didn't move. Then, after several tense seconds, he let out a breath and unlocked a file drawer. "Fine, but I hope you know what you're getting yourself into." Emily frowned. What did that mean? But before she could ask, Higgins shoved a thick file into her hands and turned back to his desk. Weird. Shaking off the feeling of unease, she turned and walked back to the CEO's office. She didn't know that with each step she took, she was walking straight into a trap. The moment she entered James's office, he barely looked up from his paperwork. "Got it?" he asked, extending a hand. Emily placed the file on his desk. "What exactly am I looking at?" James flipped through the pages, his face darkening with every second. Then, before she could blink, he snapped the folder shut and picked up his phone. "Send in Mr. Callahan," he said into the receiver. Emily's stomach twisted. Callahan, one of the most powerful board members of the company, and James's biggest enemy. Within minutes, Callahan stormed into the office, his face red with fury. "What the hell is this? Sterling?" he barked, slamming his hands on the desk. James leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered. "This," he said, tapping the file, "is proof of fraud." Callahan's jaw clenched. Emily suddenly felt very, very small. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Callahan hissed, turning to glare at Emily. "But I hope you understand that you just made the biggest mistake of your career." Emily's blood ran cold. "What?" she breathed. James remained silent. Callahan took a slow, measured breath. Then he turned to James. "You really think this little stunt is going to save you? I'll bury you before you get the chance." With that, he stormed out. Emily turned to James, heart pounding. "What just happened?" she asked. James was still watching the door, still unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "You should leave early today." Emily froze. "What? Go home, Carter?" Her stomach dropped. No, 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 no. She had seen too many people get that exact line before their termination letter arrived the next morning. "James," she said, voice quieter now, "please tell me I didn't just walk into something I shouldn't have." James's jaw tightened. "Go home, Emily." And that was the moment she realized. She had just been used as a pawn. And now, she was being thrown away. Emily spent the rest of the day waiting for the inevitable. And sure enough, the next morning, she was fired. HR didn't even give her a real reason. "Your services are no longer needed," they said. Just like that, she was erased. And James? Nowhere to be found. The man who had pushed her, challenged her, trusted her, had disappeared when she needed him the most. She packed up her things in silence, walking past the same desks where people used to glance at her with curiosity and admiration. Now, they averted their eyes, afraid to get caught in the mess. Cowards. Emily refused to cry. She refused to break. But as she stepped into the cold rain, clutching the box of everything she had left, she let out a shuddering breath. What now? Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before looking. A message. From James. Meet me at 10 p.m. My driver will pick you up. Emily's heart pounded. No, absolutely not. But even as her brain screamed to walk away, she knew she was going to meet him. Because whatever this was, whatever game James Sterling was playing, she wasn't finished yet. Small diamond, before we dive into this intense moment in Emily's journey, tell us, what would you do in her place? Would you meet James Sterling or walk away forever? Drop a comment below and let's hear your thoughts. Small diamond. Emily Carter knew this was a mistake. Yet, here she was, standing outside a luxury penthouse at exactly 10 p.m. Heart pounding so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. She wasn't sure if it was anger, curiosity, or the deep ache of betrayal that had brought her here. Maybe all three. The rain from earlier had stopped, but the cold night air sent shivers through her body. She shouldn't have come, but after losing everything, her job, her reputation, her future, she needed answers. And James Sterling was the only one who could give them to her. Her fists clenched at the thought of him, the man who had thrown her into the fire and left her to burn. Did he regret it? Or was she just another pawn in his never-ending game of power? With one final deep breath, she knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her. And there he stood, James Sterling, perfectly composed, unshaken, unbothered, the same man who had just cost her everything. Emily should have slapped him. Instead, she walked inside. The penthouse was just as ridiculously extravagant as she imagined, floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive furniture, the kind of luxury that screamed power and privilege. Emily barely spared at a glance. She was here for one reason. She turned to James, arms crossed. Start talking. James poured himself a glass of whiskey. Completely unfazed. Would you like a drink? Emily's rage boiled over. I don't want a drink. James, I want an explanation. James sighed, setting his glass down. I knew you wouldn't let this go. Emily's eyes burned. You ruined my career, and you're acting like I should just move on? James met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. I didn't ruin your career, Emily. I saved it. She let out a bitter laugh. You saved it? By getting me fired? James didn't react to her sarcasm. You weren't fired because of me. You were fired because you were about to become collateral damage. Emily's breath caught. Collateral damage? James nodded, stepping closer. Callahan was going to take you down. Emily, the second you handed me that file, you became a threat to him. Emily swallowed. She knew Callahan was dangerous. But he had the board under his control. James continued. The moment he realized you were working with me, you became his next target. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. You're lying, she whispered. James's gaze hardened. Am I? A sharp memory surfaced in Emily's mind. The way people in the finance department had looked at her when she asked for the reports. The way Higgins had hesitated before handing them over. The way Callahan had glared at her. His promise clear as day. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. Oh, God. Had James actually been protecting her? Emily shook her head. If you knew this, why didn't you warn me? James's expression darkened. Because if I warned you, you wouldn't have walked away. And if you stayed, Callahan would have destroyed you. She stared at him, trying to process it all. So, what? You let me believe you betrayed me? James's jaw clenched. It was the only way to make sure you left. Emily's chest tightened. This didn't make sense. This wasn't the cold, calculated James Sterling she knew. This was something else. Something personal. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. And what happens now? I lost my job. My name is probably ruined in the industry. James studied her. Then, to her complete shock, he smirked. That depends, he said. Do you want your job back? Emily froze. What? James took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. I need you, Emily. Her heart pounded. What was he saying? I need someone I trust. He continued. Someone who isn't afraid of a fight. Someone who won't break under pressure. Emily's breath hitched. He wasn't just offering her job back. He was offering something bigger. A position by his side. A role that no one else had. Emily should have walked away. After everything he had done, everything he had put her through, she should have walked away. But deep down, she knew the truth. James Sterling never trusted anyone. Yet he was trusting her. Her instincts screamed at her to say no. But her heart whispered something else. You were made for this, Emily. She took a deep breath. If I say yes, what happens next? James's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. We rebuild, he said, together. Emily's stomach flipped at the way he said it, as if she was the missing piece he had been waiting for. She swallowed. And Callahan? James's eyes darkened. He'll regret ever coming after you. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. She had just stepped into a game far bigger than she ever imagined. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Emily Carter wasn't just coming back. She was coming back stronger. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the penthouse balcony. The city skyline stretching before her like a vast, endless possibility. And yet, she had never felt so trapped. Behind her, inside the luxurious suite, James Sterling watched her in silence. Waiting for her to say something. Waiting for her to decide if she was going to forgive him, or walk away forever. The man who had ruined her life, and then, in the most twisted way, saved it. Could she trust him again? Could she ever let go of the pain? A gust of wind blew past, sending a chill down her spine. Or maybe the chill came from the reality of her situation. James had given her the truth. Had confessed everything. Had even offered her a second chance, to work by his side. To rebuild her career. To start over. But could she really do it? Could she put aside the betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, and take the biggest risk of her life? She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. And what she saw scared her. Because for the first time, James Sterling looked afraid. James Sterling was a man who didn't fear anything. He had built an empire from the ground up, turned his name into power, and never once looked back. People respected him, people feared him, and yet, standing in front of her now, he looked like a man afraid to lose something that actually mattered. Emily's heart clenched at the realization. Because deep down, she had always wondered if she was just another piece in his chess game. Another pawn he could move around. Another calculated risk. But this wasn't calculated. This was raw, unguarded, and it made her question everything. She had seen James Sterling win every battle, except this one. Because for the first time, he couldn't control the outcome. Emily took a shaky breath. You let me believe you betrayed me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You let me suffer alone. You let me lose everything. James's jaw tightened. I had to. No, she snapped. You didn't. Her hands clenched into fists as the memories crashed over her. The moment she realized her career was over. The way people whispered behind her back, turning away the second she entered the room. The way she cried herself to sleep, night after night, trying to understand why he had done it. You let me drown, she choked out. And now you expect me to just forget it? James exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I never expected you to forget, he said. I just hoped that you'd understand. Emily scoffed. Understand? How could she understand losing everything? How could she understand the nights she spent doubting herself, wondering if she was ever good enough? How could she understand the way he just walked away? Her voice cracked. I trusted you. James flinched. And in that moment, she saw it. Regret. Not the cold, indifferent kind. Not the strategic, businesslike kind. Real regret. The kind that haunts a person. The kind that doesn't let them sleep at night. James Sterling, the man who never showed weakness, was standing in front of her, broken. And that was the part that hurt the most. Because it meant that despite everything, he had cared. Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Emily wiped at her eyes. Frustrated at herself. She didn't come here to cry. She came here to decide. James finally spoke. I know I don't deserve another chance, he said. I know I don't deserve your trust. He took a deep breath. But I'm asking for it anyway. Emily's heart pounded. A second chance. That was what he was offering. Not just for her career. Not just for her future. For them. She thought about the months she spent hating him. The months she spent wishing she could undo it all. But she also thought about the way he had stood up for her when no one else did. The way he had taken every risk to protect her, even if she didn't know it at the time. The way he was still here, looking at her like she was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Could she trust him? Could she forgive him? Her pulse thundered as she took a shaky step forward. And then another. until she was standing so close that she could see the storm in his eyes. James didn't move, didn't even breathe, because this was it. This was the moment everything would change. Emily swallowed hard. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the night air, she said, "Don't make me regret this." James's entire body tensed. And then, he exhaled, like he had been holding his breath this whole time. Like she had just saved him. And in some strange, twisted way, maybe she had. Emily Carter sat in the dimly lit hotel room, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed as if letting go would send her crashing into an abyss she couldn't escape. The weight in her chest was unbearable. The truth, the one she had tried to ignore, to push down, to deny, was staring her in the face. James Sterling wasn't hers to love. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. Outside the window, the city lights flickered like stars against the glass. But she couldn't see them. All she could see was him, standing just a few feet away, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Was it regret? Pain? Hope? Did it even matter anymore? Because no matter what James felt, it didn't change the truth. He had lied. He had betrayed her. And now, after everything, after months of unanswered questions and sleepless nights, he wanted her to stay. He wanted her to forgive him, to pretend as if her heart hadn't been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. But how? How could she stay when every time she looked at him, she saw the version of herself that had once believed in forever? A version that no longer existed. James took a step forward, his voice low, careful, as if one wrong word would break her completely. "Emily, please." Her body trembled at the sound of his voice. God, how many times had she dreamed of hearing him say her name again? How many nights had she closed her eyes and imagined that maybe, just maybe, he would come back? That he would explain. That it would all make sense. But it didn't. And it never would. "You don't get to say my name like that," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not after what you did." James exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "I didn't have a choice." Emily let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and exhausted. "There is always a choice, James. And you didn't choose me." She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands curled into fists like he wanted to fight this. Fight her. Fight the truth. But he couldn't. Because he knew, she was right. "I didn't tell you everything," he finally said, his voice hoarse, almost desperate. Emily swallowed hard. She knew this game. She knew how he worked. James Sterling didn't lose. He always had a final move. A last-minute play. A way to make her second-guess herself. And damn him, it was working. Because even now, even after everything, she still wanted to believe him. Still wanted to believe that this wasn't just another game. But then she saw it. The hesitation. The flicker of something in his eyes that he was trying to bury. And suddenly, she knew. There was still one last secret. And this time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear it. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James inhaled deeply, his hands tightening at his sides. "When I left," he hesitated, "it wasn't just about the company. It wasn't just about the deal." Emily frowned, her heart hammering. "Then what was it?" James took another step closer, his voice haunted. "I left because someone threatened your life." Silence. A cold, suffocating silence. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered. James's expression was unreadable, but his hands were trembling slightly. "Someone came to me. Someone powerful. They gave me a choice. Walk away from you. Destroy your career. Or," he swallowed, "or you'd be dead within a week." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. Her mind spun as the words crashed into her like a hurricane. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't. She stumbled back, shaking her head. "You're lying." James's eyes darkened. "Do I look like I'm lying, Emily?" She stared at him, her hands shaking, her knees weak. Why didn't you tell me?" she choked out. "Because I couldn't risk it." He ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Emily, I knew you. I knew if I told you, you would fight it. You would try to fix it. And I couldn't lose you." Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to scream, to hate him, to walk away and never look back. But how could she? How could she hate the man who had given up everything to protect her, without her even knowing? Emily squeezed her eyes shut. Her heart and mind were at war. She had spent so long believing one thing. only to find out the truth was something entirely different. It should have made a difference. But the pain was still there. The damage was still done. I don't know if I can forgive you, she whispered. James exhaled, his voice filled with something fragile. Then don't. Hate me if you have to. Walk away if you need to. But at least now, you know the truth. Emily's vision blurred with tears. She had spent so long begging for the truth. And now that she had it, she wished she didn't. She wiped her face, trying to calm the storm inside her. James watched her, his expression unreadable, his hands clenching at his sides as if he was forcing himself not to reach for her. Emily's heart clenched. Maybe in another life, they would have worked out. Maybe in another world, they would have been happy. But here, this world had already broken them. She took a deep, shaky breath. Then, she looked up at him one last time. I wish things were different. James's face crumbled. Me too, he whispered. And then, she walked away. Not because she didn't love him, but because sometimes, love wasn't enough. Before we continue, let's hear from you. Have you ever been caught between holding on and letting go? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Emily sat in the quiet of her apartment, staring at her phone. The screen glowed with an unread message. James. It had been 3 days. 3 days since she had walked away. 3 days since she had looked him in the eye and told him that love wasn't enough. But if that were true, why did it still feel like he was everywhere? Why did his voice still echo in her mind? Why did her heart still ache at the thought of never seeing him again? She exhaled, squeezing her eyes shut. It would be so easy to call him. To hear his voice one more time. To tell him that maybe, just maybe, they could try again. But she knew the truth. Some things couldn't be undone. Some wounds didn't heal with time. And the hardest thing she would ever have to do was stay gone. The knock on her door was quiet, almost hesitant. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She knew before she even opened it. James. She hesitated. She could pretend she wasn't home. Pretend she didn't hear him. Pretend that she wasn't still madly in love with the man who had broken her. But her hands betrayed her. Her heart betrayed her. And before she could stop herself, she unlocked the door and opened it. James stood there, looking worn in a way she had never seen before. His usual confidence was gone. His suit was slightly wrinkled. His hair disheveled, as if he hadn't slept. But it was his eyes that shattered her. Dark, tired, broken. Emily, he breathed. Her heart clenched painfully. She should have slammed the door. Should have told him to leave. But instead, she just stood there, watching, waiting, because despite everything, she knew that whatever he had come to say, she needed to hear it. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for words. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I know I'm the last person you want to see right now. Emily let out a bitter laugh, folding her arms. You think? He nodded, the corners of his lips twitching slightly. But I had to see you. Her stomach twisted. She should stop him now. Tell him this was pointless. That whatever he had to say wouldn't change anything. But she didn't. Because deep down, she wasn't sure if that was true. James took a step closer. I never wanted to hurt you, he whispered. Emily's throat tightened. I know. But I did. She swallowed hard. Yes. James sighed, his gaze searching hers. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. But I can't let you think I walked away because I didn't love you. Her heart skipped a beat. James, I love you. Emily, his voice cracked. I have loved you since the moment I met you. And I never stopped. Tears burned in her eyes. God, how many nights had she dreamed of hearing those words? How many times had she imagined him coming back, begging her to believe him? But it wasn't that simple. It was never that simple. I don't doubt that you love me, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked at her, hope flickering in his tired eyes. But love isn't enough. His expression fell. Emily, don't do this, he pleaded. Her chest ached. She had always been weak when it came to him. But not this time. Not anymore. We are poison to each other, she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Every time I let you back in, I lose myself. I can't keep doing this. James shook his head. No. His voice was firm, desperate. You're wrong. We can fix this. Emily let out a shaky breath. I don't want to fix it. His face crumbled. For the first time since she had known him, James Sterling had nothing to say. Because he knew it too. She wasn't saying these words out of anger. Not out of spite. She was saying them because she loved him too much to keep breaking them both. James stepped back, running a hand over his face. She could see the pain in every movement. See the weight of what they could have been crashing down on him. Finally, he looked at her, his expression unreadable. Is this really it? He asked. Emily's heart clenched. She wanted to say no. Wanted to throw herself into his arms and pretend they could rewrite their story. But she knew better. She had always known better. She nodded. James exhaled sharply, nodding once. And then, without another word, he walked away. Emily stood frozen, watching his figure disappear down the hall. Waiting, hoping, praying he would turn around. But he didn't. And for the first time since she had met him, Emily let him go. The air was thick with the weight of words unsaid. Emily stood at the edge of the airport terminal, gripping her suitcase tighter than necessary. It had been 6 months. 6 months since she had told James goodbye. 6 months since she had walked away from the only man who had ever truly owned her heart. She thought time would dull the ache. That the distance would make it easier. That she would wake up one morning and feel free. But standing here now, ready to leave the city for good, she realized something terrifying. Some loves don't fade. Some loves don't weaken. Some loves become a part of you. And no matter how far she ran, James Sterling would always be a shadow in the background of her life. She hadn't told anyone she was leaving. No goodbyes. No announcements. Just a one-way ticket to anywhere that didn't have memories of him. But as she turned to walk toward the gate, a voice froze her in place. Emily. The world tilted. The air vanished from her lungs. Because she knew that voice. Knew it better than her own. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned, and there he was. James. Standing just feet away, looking at her with the kind of intensity that made her chest feel too tight. Too full. Too everything. Her fingers trembled against the handle of her suitcase. What are you doing here? She asked. Barely able to get the words out. James didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at her with too many emotions to name. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Voice low. She swallowed hard. Because it's none of your business anymore. A flicker of something crossed his face. Hurt. Frustration. Something deeper. Something that told her he wasn't ready to let go. Emily, don't do this, James said. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. I already did. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. You think leaving will fix things? His voice cracked slightly. That running away will make you stop loving me? Her chest ached. James? No, he cut her off. Stepping closer. Tell me, look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel anything for me anymore. She clenched her jaw. She wanted to lie. Wanted to tell him she was over it. That she was fine. That she didn't lose sleep thinking about him. Didn't wake up reaching for him. Didn't love him still. But she couldn't. Because the truth was written all over her face. And James saw it. He always saw it. His expression softened. His voice barely a whisper. Then why are you leaving? Her eyes burned. Because loving you hurts too much. James took another step. And this time, she didn't move away. I would have fought for you. He murmured. She let out a shaky breath. But we were always fighting. Silence. Heavy. Painful. She could see the war happening in his eyes. James had never been the kind of man to beg. To plead. To ask for anything. But here he was. Standing in front of her. Fighting a battle he had never fought before. For her. For them. Stay. He whispered. Her heart shattered. Because God. She wanted to. She wanted to stay so badly it felt like she was breaking in half. But if she did, they would just destroy each other all over again. Emily stepped forward until she was close enough to feel his warmth. Close enough to see the way his jaw tensed. The way his hands curled into fists at his sides. As if holding himself back from reaching for her. She lifted a trembling hand, pressing it against his cheek. He leaned into her touch like it was the only thing keeping him standing. Tears slipped down her face as she whispered the words she knew would haunt her forever. I love you. James inhaled sharply. But I can't stay. A silent tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Didn't move. Didn't even try to change her mind. Because for the first time, he knew he couldn't. Emily took a step back. Then another. James didn't follow. Didn't stop her. Just stood there. watching her slip away like she was the most painful thing he had ever lost. She turned, walking toward the gate. Every step felt like a knife to the chest. But she kept going, because some endings are necessary, even when they kill you. And as she handed her ticket to the agent and stepped onto the plane, she made herself one final promise. She would learn how to breathe without him, even if it took a lifetime. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever lost someone because you realized too late how much they meant to you? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. The rain poured heavily outside, drowning the city in an endless symphony of sorrow. Ethan sat in the backseat of his car, fingers curled tightly around the invitation that had arrived 2 days ago. An invitation to her wedding. The words blurred as he read them over and over. A cruel reminder that he had lost her. That he had taken too long. That she had waited, and finally stopped waiting. His chest tightened. He had told himself not to come. Told himself this was her day. Told himself he had no right to be here. But his heart had dragged him to this place like a man grasping at the last fragments of a shattered dream. And now, as he sat there, watching through the rain-streaked window as people stepped into the grand cathedral, laughter and love filling the air, he felt like a ghost. A shadow lurking in the corner of a story that no longer belonged to him. Her name was Olivia, and once upon a time, she had been his entire world. They had been inseparable, best friends, almost something more, but he had been a coward. Too focused on his career. Too afraid to risk their friendship. Too blind to see that while he had been chasing success, she had been waiting for him to choose her. He had always thought they had time. That one day, when things settled, when his life was more secure, he would turn around and Olivia would still be there. But love doesn't wait forever. And he had learned that lesson too late. The first time Ethan had realized he was in love with Olivia was the night she had told him goodbye. They had been sitting on the rooftop of his apartment, a place that had always been theirs. She had stared at the city lights, her expression unreadable. "I got a job offer," she had said softly. He had smiled, clueless to what was coming. "That's great. Live where?" Her hands had tightened in her lap. "Paris." His world had tilted. The words had barely registered before she had turned to him with a sad smile. "I'm leaving next week." His chest had caved in. "Next week?" he had repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it less real. She had nodded. And then, the words that still haunted him to this day. "I waited for you, Ethan. I waited for you to see me." She had stood up, brushing off invisible dust from her dress. "But I can't wait anymore." And just like that, she had walked away. And he had let her. Because he was an idiot. Ethan swallowed hard as he stepped out of the car, the rain drenching his suit instantly. He didn't care. He needed to see her. Needed to tell her, even if it was too late. The church doors were open, revealing the warm golden glow of candlelight and the soft melody of a violin playing in the distance. His heart thundered in his chest. And then, he saw her, standing at the end of the aisle in a white gown that made her look like something out of a dream. His dream. Her hands were in someone else's. Her smile was for someone else. Her heart no longer belonged to him. A sharp pain stabbed through his ribs. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his mistake. And then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Their eyes met. And in that moment, everything stopped. Her lips parted slightly. Shock. Maybe something else. But it was too late. Because the priest was speaking. Because the man beside her, her fiancé, was looking at her with love in his eyes. Because she had moved on. Ethan turned on his heel and walked away. The walls of the church suffocating him. He barely made it outside before his breath broke. Before his knees hit the ground. Before he realized that he had truly, irreversibly lost her. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the old photos of them together. Her laughter frozen in time. Her happiness once shared with him. Now, she belonged to someone else. And he had to learn how to live with that. Because some love stories don't get a happy ending. Some love stories are just a lesson. A painful, gut-wrenching lesson. To never take love for granted. To never assume someone will wait forever. To never let fear make choices for you. And as Ethan closed his eyes, one final thought whispered through his mind. If only he had told her sooner. It had been 5 years since Ethan walked out of that church in the pouring rain. Heartbroken and full of regret. 5 years since he had watched Olivia marry someone else. 5 years since he had told himself to let her go. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, she was still there. In his thoughts. In the way he compared every woman he met to her. In the songs that played on the radio. In the quiet moments when he was alone with nothing but his regrets. Life had moved on, but a part of his heart had remained stuck in that moment. In that church, watching the woman he loved slip through his fingers. But fate had other plans. It happened on a quiet autumn afternoon. Ethan was sitting in a small cafe, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee, when he heard a familiar laugh. A laugh that had haunted his dreams. His heart stopped. Slowly, he turned, and there she was. Olivia. She stood near the counter. Her long brown hair slightly curled at the ends. Her smile just as radiant as he remembered. But there was something different in her eyes. A kind of exhaustion. A quiet sadness. As if life hadn't been as kind to her as he had imagined. And then, she saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. It was like time had rewound, pulling them back into the past. Finally, she took a step forward. Ethan? His throat was dry. Olivia? They sat at a table near the window, where golden sunlight spilled in, making the moment feel even more surreal. Ethan studied her carefully, noticing the absence of a wedding ring on her finger. She stirred her tea, avoiding his gaze. "How have you been?" she asked softly. He let out a quiet laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, I don't know." She finally looked at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "I heard about your company. You did well." He shrugged. "I did everything I said I would, but none of it mattered as much as I thought it would." A small, sad smile tugged at her lips. "I know the feeling." Silence settled between them, and then, he finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Are you happy?" Olivia inhaled sharply. Then she shook her head. "No. Not really." Ethan's chest tightened. "I thought," he swallowed hard, "I thought he made you happy." She gave him a wistful smile. "He was a good man. But, he wasn't you." His heart nearly stopped. She set her cup down and took a deep breath. "I tried to love him the way I loved you, Ethan. I really did. But love, real love, the kind that stays with you no matter how much time passes, you can't force it." Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "I should have never married him." Ethan felt like he couldn't breathe. She still loved him. After all this time, she still loved him. "I thought I lost you forever," he admitted, his voice raw. "You almost did," she whispered. His hands clenched into fists. "I was a fool, Olivia. I was so afraid of ruining what we had that I didn't see I was ruining it by not choosing you." She looked at him with glistening eyes. "I waited, Ethan, for so long." Regret burned through him. "I know." She swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. "And if we do this, if we try again, will you fight for me this time? Or will I be waiting again?" His chest ached at the thought of losing her again. He reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "No more waiting," he promised. "Not ever again." That was the beginning of something new. Not a rekindling of an old flame, but a fresh start. A love that was built not on regrets and missed opportunities, but on the lessons they had learned. They took their time. They talked about everything, the past, the pain, the things they had been too afraid to say before. And this time, there was no fear, only love. And when Ethan got down on one knee a year later, under the same stars where she had once told him goodbye, she didn't hesitate. This time, they got it right. If this story moved you, drop it in the comments. Because here's the truth. Love doesn't always come at the perfect time. Sometimes, we meet the right person at the wrong time. Sometimes, fear makes us hold back. Sometimes, we don't realize how much someone means to us until they're gone. But if life ever gives you a second chance, take it. Don't let fear make your choices. Don't let pride hold you back. And most importantly, don't wait until it's too late to tell someone how you feel. Tell us in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Hit like if this story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional stories because sometimes, love finds its way back.